Good morning. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thrilled to have you all this morning, and we've been really gratified at the continued interest in our Business Over Breakfast webinar series. Just a request for anybody who is interested on any other topics that you might find useful at this particular time, please let us know, and we will look to see whether or not we can find faculty that could talk on a specific topic of interest. However, today we have Professors Patrick Noonan and Lynne Segall in the last of their three webinar series on problem solving in a virtual world. And this morning they're going to be talking about how do you make the case effectively using virtual delivery. There's no need to despair. Patrick and Lynne are also going to be teaching an executive education program starting August 19th, actually on some of the topics that they've been covering in the last 3 weeks, on how to approach problems like a management consultant. So if you've been enjoying these webinars, please investigate that, and if you want to have a deeper dive into the work that they're doing. Next week, Professor Tom Smith is back for an update on economic challenges facing us as we navigate our way into, I think, month 4 of social distancing. And this time, many of us have children who are no longer doing virtual school. So that has increased the challenges around, because of course there's no camps, there's no very little for them to be doing. So that's next week. And then also David Noor, who we saw at the beginning of May, is back with a deeper dive on agile alignment and strategy visualization in an executive education course starting June 9th. Just a quick reminder of how this webinar will go. Patrick and Lynne will take us through the content that they have around how to make an effective case and do it in this virtual world. Any questions that you have, please put in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to get to them. Only one last thing for me to say, and that is I hope you enjoy your morning with Lynne and Patrick, and I look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Thank you so much. Bye.
All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Patrick Noonan, and I'm delighted to be here again with my colleague and co-author, Lynne Segall, for the third of this particular series of talks about problem solving, with a particular eye to some of the challenges that we face that are different, special in this virtual environment that many of us are finding ourselves immersed in. And as you heard from Nicola, we'll be talking today mostly about how do we make the case in the virtual environment. As we have done in the past, let's get settled in and let's find out a little bit about this virtual environment that is geographically distributed. If you please go to a browser, any browser. It can be on your phone, it can be on your desktop, and go to menti.com. And then what you'll see at menti.com is a session code, and today's session code is going to be 252710. So type in 252710, and then you'll be served up the most current of our polling questions. And our first question today is, where are you? And you should see that coming up on your browser. I'm going to switch the sharing over to that, and then we'll be able to see live where people actually are coming in from. So let's just flip over to that and see what we've got. It looks like we've got nice and big in the center, Atlanta, Georgia, and also people describing where they are as home. This is and home office. This is one of the things that we've seen from the start of this series, is that this entire question of where are we is a fuzzy, multi-layer kind of a question, because we've got geographic dispersion, but also it's, well, where at our office, and geographically where that happens to be may not be the most important issue. So again, a lot of people from Atlanta, but we've got some people from some other areas. We have had Istanbul. We've got Orlando. A number of people in Orlando. Welcome Montreal, and Marietta and Sandy Springs.
Patrick, do you want to hit present on your screen, on your Menti?
Sure, let's see if that makes it bigger for everybody.
There you go.
There we go. A little easier to see.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Wonderful.
I love seeing Philippines. Wow.
Terrific.
And the frog room. I wonder where the frog room is. Does that mean someone has pet frogs and they call it the frog room where they keep them?
Well, I mean, this raises the whole question. Notice this is a global meeting because we've got the Philippines and we've got Toronto and we've got Austin and we've got Wyoming and we've got Kuwait and we've got Athens. Is that Georgia? Is that Greece? It doesn't really matter, does it? Because we're all here together. So let's go back to the slides. Thank you for that. We'll use Menti again. So you'll want to hold on to that URL because we're going to ask you some questions again in just a second. So let's.
All right. Sorry, it's taking me just a second to get my share up there. There we go. Okay. Today we're going to talk about communication and the virtual environment means that we need to bring our A game when it comes to communication because there's less margin for error. And certainly we have principles and processes and tools that we use in a pre-pandemic world, in a non-virtual world, and in a 3D world, if you will, where we're all together in a room, that also apply in a virtual environment. And we'll talk about those today, but also we'll talk about some of the specific things that we really want to emphasize to address some of the particular challenges that are resident in a virtual environment. And before we get to the content, what we'd like to do is go back to Menti actually and give you a chance to share with us kind of on two dimensions, in two directions. First, as a presenter, what challenges do you face in a virtual environment? And then coming back to the fact that you're an audience member, what challenges do you face? So the idea here is that that by understanding these challenges that you face, we can then put in the context some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So you should now be seeing the Menti screen on your device, and let's see what some of the things are that are coming in. Yeah, face-to-face relationship building is difficult in a virtual environment. Can't see the audience response.
Yeah, reading the audience, inability to get that nonverbal communication is showing up a couple of times already. Body language,
And another audience challenge is that if people are multitasking, it's hard to get their attention and keep it.
Yeah. And then some technical issues here too, Lynne, having to do with multiple screens. One of the things that you and I have talked about in conducting these kinds of webinars is how many screens do we need? Well, just one more would be better, right? Yeah. However many we've got, and we're both working from a couple of screens because we've got so many different things to manage. And some people have to be meeting on a phone screen. Yeah. Hard to read the room. Yeah.
And you don't always know how other people are receiving your information, if they're getting it on a small screen like a phone or an iPad, or if they're seeing it on a big 27-inch monitor, or that they've got it plugged into their 50-inch TV. You don't know how they're seeing you.
Lynne, notice in the center we've got one convincing for decisions. This issue of persuasion and getting people to take action is one. I think we'll be able to talk about that one as well. All right.
Yeah, losing connectivity issues are challenging. So lots on audience, absence of nonverbal, energy and attention, and people are getting fatigued. I haven't seen this one come in, but we hear from our students, they're getting screen fatigued when you're in screened meetings all day.
Yep.
Platform, yep. Okay, good. So those are good challenges. That's helpful to see what some of the challenges that you're all facing as presenters. You're here today as an audience member, and you have been an audience member, we presume, in a number of other meetings. let's shift to the next question, Patrick, part 2 of our Mentee, which is, as an audience member or a participant, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing?
The problem of the presenter was getting people to pay attention, and as audience members, we understand that. We're very empathetic. It's hard to, it's hard to stay focused.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of distractions has shown up. Focus, fatigue, distraction.
Yeah, and I can imagine for folks who have children at home this summer, the distraction quotient will go up. Kids coming into the room, needing attention, needing help. It's hard to stay focused. Zoom fatigue as an audience member.
But to the point that Lynne was making a minute ago when she was giving us the headline, if you will, a lot of these things, to some degree, with the exception of the technical issues, are always present. They're present face to face as well. We've got issues of attention and distraction, trying to get people focused, trying to get people to be thinking about what actions that they would take, the so what,
Mm-hmm.
and moving forward. But some of these things are, of course, amplified by the distance, and then, of course, the added technical issues, the lack of control of environment. But a lot of these things, boredom in maintaining focus is a challenge that we traditionally face in regular meetings and presentations as well.
It's true.
Okay.
All right,
Good.
great. This is very helpful. So we will address some of these challenges as we talk through our material today. Let's see, how do I do this? All right, so you should be seeing the PowerPoint slide again, just checking to make sure things are working correctly. Patrick, is that what you're seeing on your screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. That's the other thing, is you think you're sharing something, or that you think you know what your audience sees, and you can't. You have to check, to make sure. We have to maybe be more transparent about checking in with our audience on things. So we're going to talk today about how you make a case effectively using virtual delivery, and what we're going to talk about today has a context, and the context really builds on the time that we've spent together over the last 2 weeks, where we talked about solving the right problem and how you collaborate effectively remotely. We don't have time today to completely rehash what we covered in the last 2 sessions, but we'll give you, just to get you grounded in that context, we'll give you a quick snapshot of the context and the way we're thinking about communication when we talk about making a case. And that context is in the context of problem solving, and the nature of work, exacerbated by the virtual environment that we find ourselves in today, is that there are big, messy, complex problems that we've got to figure out. And there's a way that we can go about figuring them out. We use the watermelon as a metaphor for the problem. And teams are given this watermelon problem, and they've got to figure out what to do with it. And it's tempting to apply what we call the smash and grab approach, where the team quickly breaks up the watermelon and everybody grabs the piece that seems relevant for maybe their function or their experience level or their interests, and they go off and marching in a different direction. And those are good intentions, because we do need to divide up the work, and we do want to leverage people's expertise, and we want to get going because there's urgency. But the smash and grab approach can also create some issues. We've all been in those meetings at the end of a project where it looks like the pieces and the parts are kind of being smushed together in a not so elegant way. We call that the duct tape approach at the end of the project. And when in the context of communication, we've all been in those situations where we've seen presentations where it looks like it might be the first time these slides have ever met each other. We like to call those Franken decks, where it's a Frankenstein kind of mishmash of material. And that's because teams have what we call smashed the watermelon. And so in the context of figuring it out, what we need to do is move from this jumble of issues to get to some sort of action, because that's where impact happens. And the skills that we apply to navigate our way through this process are what we call craft skills, because they're not skills that you can just learn once and then do really well the very first time you're trying it. They're skills that you build and hone and develop over time and through practice and experience and coaching and mentorship. But there are a set of principles that we follow when teaching this approach, and also when applying this approach. And it starts with this first principle that I've already described, which is have a process, or don't smash the watermelon. But indeed, there are other principles that we also have touched on and that we go a lot deeper into in our course that Nicola mentioned. And these principles are principles that we have found are true in any context of problem solving. The idea of having a process is the first principle that we talked about in the last two sessions, that we sort of anchored our content around. And the idea is that there is a set of process steps that you can follow in a linear fashion, but they can also work in a modular way. But the first half of the problem solving process is really about defining the problem. And we do that in the form of a question, breaking down the problem and planning the work. We talked about in our first session the idea that defining that problem was really figuring out, I gotta get my fingers to match the picture, to figure out the frame. What about this situation do we need to figure out, and what's out of scope? Who are the players that we need to engage in the process? And we define that problem in the context of a question. And that question is sort of the bullseye of everything that we need to figure out at the very beginning. It's what we're shooting at. Then we break down that question into a hierarchy of smaller questions. And we talked about a tool that we use called a question tree or an issue tree, which is about surfacing all of the relevant issues that you need to resolve in order to address that central issue, and then organizing them into a hierarchy that can get you to the work. And then we also talked about how we can use collaboration tools in a virtual environment that can simulate some of the things that we enjoyed doing in person when we could be together in 3D, sticky notes being one of the most valuable technologies that we have for collaboration. And so we introduced tools like Lucidchart, and we demonstrated how you might use tools like Lucidchart or Miro or IdeaFlip, et cetera, to enable real-time collaboration. So that's the context in which we find ourselves today as we now think about making that case effectively in the virtual delivery setting. So Patrick, I'm going to hand it back to you to talk about that case that we need to make. And we see your screen, but we don't.
Yeah, let's get the share of the presentation. How about that? Let's look at the slide.
I'm seeing it. It's up.
Okay. There we go. Well, today's session is about making this case, and in a minute we're going to flip back over to Lynne to talk about that. We've been asking you questions about presenting and being an audience, and so communication is really an essential part of that. But let's back up a second. What case? Where does this come from? There's a couple of other steps that we feel are important parts of getting to the case. You don't just start imagining what the project work is, and then all of a sudden magically come up with an answer and start writing slides. We want to break it down a little bit more. We need a lot more time to get into depth, but there was a couple of important points that we wanted to share today that also have some additional challenges in the virtual environment. The next step of the process, as we described, is you actually do the work. So in step 3, we've planned the work. In step 4, we're working the plan. And this is where we're moving forward and pivoting, if you will, to from the question-oriented thinking to answer-oriented thinking. What can we do in this step that's especially challenging in a virtual environment? Well, you have to know when your work is done. And the work isn't done just because you've ticked off all of the items on your work plan. The work is done when you've gotten the insights that you need, when you've had those ahas and you've got good solid recommendations that you can start to develop and move forward. So there's a kind of an integration, there's kind of a cooking of the analysis and the work that's got to go on, where you might have some disparate, separate analyses that somehow you've got to be able to put things together and figure out what they mean for a conclusion and a recommendation and an action plan. Well, how do you do that? Well, one of the things you can do is what we call the Winnie the Pooh method, which is you can just go think, think, think. One, ow. Two, not really that effective. What can we use that helps us move in that direction? Well, we use something that we call the so what ladder. The idea of the so what ladder is to use a phrase, so what, in a very constructive, cooperative way to pull ourselves up from the weeds of the analysis to the actual actions. And so when we talk about so what, we're talking about not, let's see, here's part of the challenge is that if you don't look at me, if you don't see my body language, so what sounds like a challenge. It sort of sounds like, here's the body language here, so what, where somebody says so what to you, it's sort of like a challenge or like it's dismissive. But the so what we're talking about is more like this. You can see it's more what we call yes and. We've each taken courses in improvisational comedy, which we recommend, by the way. Improv is a difficult skill, very, very applicable to communication and to teamwork. But the idea of yes and is that you build on what is there. And so what we're talking about in consulting language, so what means yes and. And so it's a way to build a culture of challenge that's constructive. Let's move from the facts to the findings. We've got data, what do they mean? What's the simplest objective meaning? Well, what does that mean? What can we conclude about the business problem? What does it mean about a recommendation? And what do those recommendations mean about what action steps we take? And so the idea of the so what ladder is to use the so what in the yes and mode to be able to move from the weeds of analysis to actual action plans. Well, the challenges in the virtual environment are, we saw some of that in some of the pain points that you shared with us, which is that you don't have a lot of interpersonal context. And it's body language, it's tone, it's a lot of the ability to work together where you can find a way, you need to find a way to make so what part of the culture, to get out of the weeds and to get to actions, but to do it in a way where people feel that they are part of a cooperative culture and a cooperative process that's building together. It's let's, yes, and what can we do, and not criticism and challenges. The other thing that Lynne and I talk about a lot is that there seems to be this feeling that you come up with an answer and then immediately start writing slides. Let's slice that up a little bit further. In particular, Lynne and I talk a lot about a step 5 called building the case. You have the insight, you've got the recommendation, you think. You don't just immediately communicate it. You have to stress test it. So as engineers do in the real world when they're building buildings and bridges and so forth, they'll take samples of concrete and try to crush it to find out the strength so they know what it can support. We need to stress test our own work. There's a lot of different ways to do that, and we can get into that in more detail in a future session or in our August course. But the idea is that we need to think about the engineering and the stability of our logic and our evidence and the practicality. So there's a lot of things we can do specifically to stress test and self-critique our own work before we get it out in front of other people. One of the tools we mentioned very briefly last time, another hierarchy. We talked a lot last time about hierarchies of questions, coming up with a question tree. The opposite side is the answer tree. Some of you may know this as the pyramid principle or a logic pyramid, where we take our recommendation and we think about what are the supporting arguments, what's the why and how underneath that, and what's the why and how underneath those, and what's the evidentiary support at the bottom that holds up the entire thing. And that's something that we call the answer tree. And once again, we can use the same kind of collaborative tools that Lynne mentioned and we demonstrated last time. We can still collaborate with that to come up with the stress testing in a virtual environment, because we've got the tools to be able to manage that as well. Once we've gotten to that point, we are able to make the case and to focus on communication. We've figured out what the plan is, we've done the work, we've used the so what ladder to get ourselves to insights. We've then taken the time to stress test in many ways, more than we could talk about today, our work to make sure that we have a very solid case that we believe, and that we believe has all the elements that the other people need. How do we close that gap?
Yeah, so the way that we're going to talk about closing that gap is through what we call the 5S model of communication. And we're going to walk you through the pieces and parts of this model, starting with strategy. The idea is that each of these pieces is part of a whole, and they need to fit together as a whole, but we can tease them apart and think about them each individually. So the strategy is really about starting with our goals. What is it that we need to achieve in this communication? It's surprising how many teams actually skip this step altogether. They go right from analysis. They usually skip building the case also, by the way, and jump right into a slide creation mode or a slide sorting mode where everybody's already created a bunch of slides and starts slapping them together. In a virtual environment in particular, taking a step back and really thinking about the question, at the end of this communication, my listeners will. And what is it that you need them to do? Starting with who are they and where are they on the change curve? So I knew that the leaf blowers were going to get outside my window right as I was talking, which is another challenge of virtual communication.
I don't think anybody said leaf blowers. They did say some outside noise and distraction. No, I don't think
Outside noise, yes. So I'm hoping that by having a fancy microphone, most of that outside noise is getting drowned out. But of course, they had to show up at my window right now. So this change model that we often see in change management on the bottom of the slide is actually a helpful device for us to think about our audience and where they are today and where we need to get them. And the idea is that you often can't move somebody multiple steps in one communication, which has relevance for one of the other points that we want to think about when we think about strategy, which I'll get to in a minute. And that's the idea of pre-selling. We do have choices about how we're going to communicate. Now, in this picture, these people clearly are not social distancing, but we do, even though our choices are more limited in a virtual communication delivery, we do still have choices. And those choices include things like, do we want to have a dialogue, or is this a one-way presentation? How do we want everybody's phone mute or sound muted, or do we want to encourage conversation? Do we want to build in engagement tools like Menti to get other sources of feedback from the audience and keep them engaged? So there are strategic choices we can make about format. And one of the other strategic choices we can make that I alluded to is this idea of pre-selling. Now, this is a lot more difficult to do in a virtual environment, but the idea here is there may be some of those folks in the audience that need a little bit of a pre-show, or they need to have a specific part of the presentation or specific ideas socialized with them in advance. And so it's harder to do in a virtual environment because you can't just sort of conveniently run into them while getting coffee in the break room or happen by their office to say, oh, by the way, that you might do in a physical environment. You're going to have to actually think about giving them a call or planning a meeting, but that's part of the strategy to think about as well. So and one more thing about strategy is, particularly in this idea of pre-selling, be very careful about pre-selling numbers. So numbers, we know from all the studies around cognitive bias, is that they are pretty sticky. They're sort of hard to shake off. People remember numbers, and that's why we have biases like anchoring. And this Gary Larson cartoon is sort of relevant for us to remember as we think about this caveat around pre-selling. And in the first tile, there's everything we say to dogs. Okay, Ginger, I've had it. Stay out of the garbage. We could put my dog's name in this one because it's very relevant. But what dogs actually hear is just blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger. And in the case of our audience, all they hear is blah, 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 $3 million savings or whatever. So be really careful about how you pre-sell or when you use numbers in the pre-selling. Make sure your work is complete before you throw any numbers out there. So that's strategy. Now let's talk about story. And there are a number of things that we can share around story that we believe you'll find particularly useful in a virtual environment. Certainly there's blocking out the structure of the story and crafting what we call the through line or the storyline. What's the thread that holds the whole piece of your communication together? And we've got a couple of specific tools and techniques here in this piece of our 5S model of communication that can help you around story. But the first is just the basic scaffolding. And if you think about today's session, we started with a greeting. Nicola welcomed you to the session. She gave you some context about business over breakfast as you were sort of getting settled in. Patrick set us up, and as you were gathering in this, what we call the funnel, he used the Menti to get a sense of who you all are in terms of where you are physically located. In some of our past sessions, we've also asked you for your professional affiliation, so we kind of had a sense of who you were. And then we gave you a little bit of context about what this session is about and why is it here. So we focused on the challenges that you are facing, both as a presenter and an audience. And then we led with an answer. What is the session about? So the funnel is the idea of how do you bring people into the story and prepare them for the message that you're about to give them. What is the information they need to understand to be ready? Or another way to think about it is, what's the question, what's the implicit or explicit question that your communication is going to answer? And can you plant that in their minds at the beginning as a way of engaging them? Another device that we use when we're thinking about the story is a device that's used in a number of industries. The movie industry uses it. You may even be able to figure out which movies these storyboards are tied to by looking closely at them. Finding Nemo, for example. Building the presentation and crafting the communication itself is where the cost really resides for us in communication. It's the time spent on building the slides and getting them just right. Before we invest that time, this pre-investment of thinking about the story that we need to tell and actually thinking through what role each slide will play in that story is a great device, particularly when we're working in a team, to then divide and conquer in the building of the presentation. Because if everybody on the team agrees on what the storyline is, what's the story we need to tell, then you can actually divide up the slides and assign them to different people, and everyone will know how that story is going to come back together. It can be as simple as sketching out slides in handwriting. In a 3D world, we might do this on a whiteboard in a room, but we can do it just as easily in a virtual environment. In fact, when I worked at Accenture, my team was virtual, literally spread around the globe. And this was the device that we used when we were preparing presentations. Sometimes we started with a simple table. What was the slide number? What was the message of the slide? What was the content of the slide? And then who was responsible for building that slide? Then we would get to the sketching so that we know that when we give Patrick slide number 2, we know exactly how that slide is going to fit into the overall story. There are a few other things we want you to think about story, and I'm going to pass it back to Patrick for the next piece on story. Patrick, I'm not hearing you if you're talking.
Okay, there we go.
All right.
All right, how about now? So you should be seeing a wide open book right now. When we write the story, we start out with the complete freedom to do whatever we like. And, we know how stories go. They have a once upon a time and they have a the end. And as you structure the story and think about the storyboard, one of the most important decisions you have to make is, well, where's the answer? if we think about a problem-solving presentation where there's some kind of action item or recommendation, where does that go? And we've got two major choices there. If we think about the presentation itself, the time of the presentation is some kind of road. Where do we put the answer? It's very common when you're telling a joke, when you're telling a story about fiction, so it's a book or a story or a movie, to put that pot of gold, that payoff at the end. You go down this long journey and then you finally get to the pot of gold. That's great for fiction and that's great for jokes. It doesn't make as much sense to give the punchline up front. And I don't want to spoil any particular movies for you, but imagine a movie that you've just seen. What if you knew at the very beginning what happened at the very end of the movie? It would be a very different experience. Those kinds of things are designed to keep us guessing. That's part of the engagement. And so the suspense and the stress is part of the feature of that kind of storytelling. In business problem solving and business presentations, we'd like you to flip the default. The default should be answer first. And by default, we mean not every time, but it means that unless you have a good reason, start with the answer. We did that today as well. As soon as we got through the funnel, what did Lynne do? She said, here's what the headline is about presentations. And she talked about the need to bring your A game in presentations, how that's harder than ever. There's a process and principle to do it. And there's a couple of specific things we need to do differently. If you had to sign off, then you'd gotten the main point. What's the rest of the presentation about? The why and the how, fleshing out the reasoning and some of the details and some of the particulars of it, but got to the answer first. So when we look at the hourglass diagram again, after the funnel, the next thing that happens by default should be the answer. So you bring everybody to some kind of central question that needs to be answered, and unless you've got a reason otherwise, you then serve up the answer. What happens next? It's the grounding. It's the why and the how. Now there's some exceptions to that. And that's what Lynne and I and our students call putting the cat on the roof. And it comes from a joke that I will try to tell quickly, but still get to the essence of it. So we've got two brothers, grown. They've gotten they've just finished graduate school or something, so they've got a lot of debt, and they still live at home with their mother. But they're good sons and very dedicated. One of them has a job in which he travels all the time, and so he goes to travels out to Chicago every week, but he's a good son and he calls home every night and then comes home on the weekend. So one week he leaves, and on Monday night, phone rings at the house, calls home, and his brother answers. Hey bro, how you doing? Oh, I'm great. How's things in Chicago? Oh, it's good. Everything's going fine. How are things at the house? Well, our cat is dead. Oh my God, that's terrible. Oh my God, I love that kitty so much, that poor thing. And what are you doing telling me that way? I said, what do you mean? I mean, if the cat's dead, the cat's dead. What am I supposed to do? He said, no, that's just, it's just so hard to hear. No, seriously, bro, I mean, what else could I do? Well, let's see. It's Monday, yeah. And I'm gone till the weekend, yeah. And I call every night, yeah. So I call today, you say, maybe, I don't know, the cat's on the roof. And I go, whoa, that's weird. It never happened before. And then we talk. And then I call on Tuesday and you say, the cat's on the roof and, she just won't come down, won't come down. We tried to get her down. She won't come down. Wow, I'm a little concerned now. And I call on Wednesday and you say, the cat's on the roof and we've tried everything we can. We are not going to be able to get her down. Oh boy, that's like, this is really strange and disturbing. Call on Thursday and you say, the cat's on the roof and she is not looking that good. Oh, okay. Call on Friday and you say, the cat, and I stop you and I say, our cat's passed away, hasn't she? And you go, yeah, that's true. Oh, okay, I get it. So like there's some news that's so powerful, maybe it's bad, that, you don't want to just hear somebody else say it, right? Yeah, that's right. Like maybe, you build up some clues and you put them together and you're the first one to actually say it. That's right. You got it exactly. Oh, good. I'm glad we had this talk. So anyway, how else? How's everything else at the house? Mom's on the roof.
I'm going to do the laughing for you, Patrick, since you can't see your audience reaction. I'm going to do the laugh track.
Yeah. Anyway, the point is that there are occasions when we flip the default and we want our audience to suffer the stress, but also the anticipation and to piece things together. We leave a trail of breadcrumbs, we might say, where, well, with respect to this new plant, sales have not been growing as much as we thought. The margins are not going to be quite as good at the new plant. Our competitor has done this, and the people in the audience are piecing it together and going, wait a minute, I'm not sure moving ahead in the way we had thought is going to be such a good idea. They hear it in their own voice first before they hear it from you. And that's what we call putting the cat on the roof.
Yeah, and just going back to that last slide for 1 second, Patrick, after we get through the answer, whether we start with the answer as the default or we put the cat on the roof and we end with the answer in a more deductive argument, we have a couple other pieces that I didn't touch on when I first covered the slide, and that is around the pivot to action, which is we got to figure out how to close this communication. And that's the get going part. And sometimes we see that in the form of next steps. Sometimes there's a call to action where it's a request for an investment now that we've made the case. So there are different ways that pivot to action may fit into the story. The idea is that the principle to follow is intention and what information you put where in your story. And then to stay with our G's, the greeting, the gathering, the giving of the clues, the get going, there's the garage, or what's traditionally known as the appendix. And the same amount of intention needs to go into the appendix as we have in the rest. And I think in the virtual environment, the appendix becomes even more important because there are some choices you have to make that we'll talk about in a few minutes around what information you put on the slide. And in a virtual environment, given some of those challenges of not knowing how your audience is receiving the information, you may need to put more detail in an appendix than you might normally do if you were giving a presentation in a room, because it's too in the nitty gritty or too much detail. So just wanted to call attention to that, and then we can switch back to where we were. And let me get mine back up. So one more thing on story that we wanted to cover before we go to the next S in our 5S communication model. And that is this idea of what happens with a table of contents or an agenda slide. And Patrick and I, between the two of us, have probably safely, we could say, sat through thousands of presentations over our career between our professional lives and student presentations and whatnot.
Thousands, yeah.
And we wish we could get the time back from the table of contents and agenda slide and all of these sorter slides that we see in slide decks, because they don't tend to add a lot of value. And when I see a slide like this example here on the page, I start getting nervous that the whole presentation is going to be a parade of the different work streams of the project with no integrated synthesis of an overall answer or set of insights. And that basically what the team did is assign chapters based on what was the piece of work that each individual did. Particularly in a virtual environment where you shared that getting people engaged and preventing them from staying distracted and telling a story and helping them stay focused, we have an antidote to this. And it works in a virtual environment, but it also, it works in an in-person environment, but we believe it's even more important in a virtual environment. And that is something we call the setup slide. The setup slide, the idea here is that instead of a table of contents or an agenda slide, we actually give the audience the answer and we give them the reasons why or the ways how or the elements or the arguments that support that answer in one slide. So if the meeting had to get cut short and we had to just go to one slide, this would be the slide that we went to, because this would be the organizing slide that would allow us to tell our entire story. This is the slide that then creates the chapters, and each of the ideas that support our recommendation becomes a chapter. So let me blow that up for you so you can see it. So the idea is, and this is a super simple example, we give 3 reasons. That's the one slide we can go to tell the whole story. But if we have the time and the capacity to go deeper, we now have 3 chapters, a chapter with a set of slides for each of those stories. It could look as simple as this. This is an example from an actual slide deck, that an integrated strategy can boost revenue. And there are 3 initiatives in this strategy. And the visual lays out what those 3 initiatives, what each of those 3 initiatives is, and the idea that revenue will be increased. And then we now know as an audience that, okay, they're going to talk about 3 different things. So if I'm the marketing person in the audience, and I care about brand, I don't have to interrupt that during the early part of the presentation, or my mind is not going to get distracted worrying about, are they going to cover brand here? I know they're going to cover it, and I can see they're going to get to it in the second initiative. And then this same setup slide structure works within the chapters. So when you get to that chapter, you can have a setup slide within the chapter that lays out what the chapter is about. So again, if things are cut short, you can go to that slide 2 and skip slides 2B, 2A, 2B, and 2C. So the setup slides is a very useful device, much more effective than agenda slides, which we find have fairly limited value. There's another choice to make about story when you're thinking about your virtual delivery, and that is what content you actually put on the slide and what content you put off the slide. What are you going to actually say in the virtual room? What is your voiceover going to be? The voiceover is really important because that's part of how you're going to engage your audience, but you have to be very intentional about what that voiceover content is, because the voiceover gets lost. It's a little bit like writing in sand. And as you move to the next slide, it's like that proverbial wave came through and washed away everything you just said in the room. Now, we do have the benefit of meetings getting recorded now in a virtual environment that we didn't have so much or as frequently in a physical space, that can address this, where a whole presentation with the recording could be shared. But what we have found is that slide decks tend to grow legs and get circulated around the room, and everything you said in the room, in the virtual room, that context, that color, that gets lost. And so the important messaging needs to be on the slide. So let's talk about those slides. Of course, you have to design the template before you ever divide and conquer, so that you don't run into the, you can see from my face, I'm not going to say the word, but the awfulness that PowerPoint can create for teams when you're trying to merge material from multiple people. So we're going to focus today on the content of the slides, the body of the slides. And we want you to think about this as a craft. In fact, people talk about building slides and they use the term slide craft. And that's because it's not some industrial process where you're just throwing content on a slide from different pieces and parts of analysis. You're not just copying and pasting out of Excel. You're crafting the slide so that it plays a specific role in the overall story. And we find that the story structure can help inform the slide structure. The two are very complementary, and you can see we have kitties in our yin and yang, and that's an homage to Patrick's cat on the roof. But there's an interplay between story structure and slide structure. The big idea, if you remember nothing else about slides, is that you can only have one idea per slide. Our friends at Duarte like to say that, you know, think about this. Would you rather see 100 slides with one idea per slide, or 10 slides with 10 ideas per slide? If you talk about helping your audience stay focused and engaged, giving them the story, an idea at a time, is going to help them stay with you and avoid the distractions much better than almost anything else you can do.
Lynn, we had, while we're here, we've been talking a lot about slides, and of course we defaulted to PowerPoint as an example here, but we got a good question from Jennifer asking about alternatives. PowerPoint is a useful but static way to do all this. Would you leverage the document camera or other software if a client needed something more dynamic, or if you felt that the story was still under construction, right? Like it's not a final presentation, maybe it's a collaborative feedback gathering discussion, right? As opposed to an endpoint what do we think about that? Again, we don't have a lot of time. We have a lot of feelings about PowerPoint and alternatives, which we've done enough time for. But the quick answer to thinking about preliminary presentations or other things, ways to make it more dynamic.
Yeah, so you'll notice that we use tools like Menti to make it more dynamic. That's part of something you'll want to think about back in the strategy step, is how, if the work is in progress, it may be a strategic choice to not show a final polished deck, but instead to maybe have an answer slide, like that first setup slide, and just use that and think about a facilitation plan and a set of questions or prompts that you want to give the audience to engage them. So it kind of, I think, depends a lot on where you are in the process, who your audience is, and in your goals for the meeting and what you want to get out of it. There are some other slick tools. A lot of people, it's less in vogue now than it was 5 or 8 years ago, this tool Prezi. To me, and Patrick, will see if you agree, to me, it's not about the tool, it's about the intention and the messaging. And PowerPoint is the most commonly used tool. But Jeff Bezos at Amazon has banned PowerPoint in his organization. You can Google this and read the memo that he wrote a number of years ago. I think it started out as he required people to write 6-page memos, and everyone in the meeting would have to read the memo first, and then they would have a discussion about the memo. I think now they're 4 pages, or maybe it's flipped. But the idea was he was tired of seeing slides that just had a bunch of random bulleted lists that said nothing. And we don't blame him.
Yeah, well, I think that, we're also big fans of the work of Edward Tufte, who created a lot of current thinking about information design. And he's not a fan of PowerPoint, but he's very specific about what it is. And he talks about how we tend to get drawn into what PowerPoint lets us do easily, which is bulleted lists. And that's a terrible and very lazy way to think. And I think what Lynn and I are saying is the issue is not so much PowerPoint, but it's even in a real face-to-face kind of environment, but it's what we do with it. And if we fall into the traps. So thinking about strategy, thinking about making it story-driven as opposed to slide-driven, and then build the slides from there is helpful. But I take your point, and I think we agree entirely that because we can't all see each other, it's so difficult to to pick up the rest of things and to make it dynamic. And so, yes, a document camera, and I actually bought one as soon as we realized a few months ago that life was going to be virtual. I picked up a very inexpensive but very good document camera. We have these great solutions to make things interactive. Tools like Lucid Chart and Miro and so forth, also ways to be able to put virtual sticky notes and to actually have people move them in real time in a group. There are a number of different ways to engage, and particularly in preliminary, when you're trying to co-build or try to evaluate what's going on. I think you're right. I think Jennifer is right that these are important tools to mix in. But at the end of the day, it does come down to whatever it is you need to tell them. It's got to be a good case, and you have to have thought strategically about the audience, your objectives. You've got to think about a story as opposed to just throwing random stuff together and so forth. Anyway, back to you, Lynn.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. When we think about our slides, we think about them as having 2 pieces or 2 parts, and that they work together. So there's the lead, we call it an action lead. This is the 1-sentence so what of the slide. Full stop. Meaning if someone read nothing else on the slide, they would know what this slide was about and they would take away the insight. And that's really important for this interplay between what you say on the slide and what you say in the room off the slide. And then there's the body. There are choices we can make about what content we put in the body of the slide that we'll talk about in a minute. But the body of the slide needs to be the grouping of text or other content that illustrates whatever that main point of the slide is. So here's a quick example that we pulled off the internet from McKinsey & Company that shows a slide that is actually very light on text. They've got 2 graphs and they've got an action lead that pulls the ideas together. The idea when it comes to a story is that each of these leads gives a complete thought, and together these leads tell the complete story, so that if your audience were to fan out your slide deck on their desk and read only the leads, they would know your complete story without having to look at all at any of the body of the slides. This is a critical device to use in a virtual format in this problem-solving context. So let's talk a little bit about the body now. The body in the slide gives us some choices. The fight that we want to have in the body is around what are those choices we're going to make about how we lay out the content. And we've got 4 basic choices. Text, which has some benefits of giving us the opportunity to give a full explanation, but it can be too wordy, and we have that device issue. Concept visuals are great, but they can be open to all kinds of interpretations. Tables show a lot of information in detail, but it's hard to convey relationships. And charts, on the other hand, can do a really nice job of conveying relationships, but they usually need some sort of explanation. We go into this in so much more detail in our course than what we can come through today. But the idea here is to just be intentional. I'll give you one example to make that point, which is like with concept visuals, we have a lot of fun with concept visuals. This is the same content, 2 different concepts, equal size chevrons, increasing size chevrons. Was the second team being cute, or is implementation actually the biggest or most important step as this example shows? Tables, a lot of detail, hard to see relationships compared to a chart. And then with charts, we see all kinds of challenges that teams have around choosing the right chart for the message. There's a great book, Say It With Charts, seminal book by Jean Zelazny, that helps you understand, based on the comparison you're trying to make, which you can figure out through some of the trigger words, there are specific chart types that are the right chart types to use for each of these comparisons.
Or at least certainly they're the most natural way to convey and to be able to connect, so that you're really focusing the audience's attention on a particular aspect of it. The way that our friends at Duarte would say it is you want to highlight the part that's important. You want to make sure that your audience is seeing right away what part of what you're showing them is the most important. And it even comes down to what chart type you're conveying. You know, if you do a scatter plot, that immediately says it's some kind of a relationship. Okay. Pies are for part to a whole and so forth. And so that's an important part of making it easier for them to quickly grasp what it is you're trying to convey. All right.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, could you advance the slide one more, please? Then yeah.
Yep, so there are 2 other S's in our framework that we don't have time to get to today. Stress testing, just like Patrick talked about in step 5 when you're building the case, there's stress testing we do here in the communication too. Some of it's about just basic polish, but mostly it's about making sure that your message is clear and that you've got the language right. And then we could do multiple sessions on the delivery or the show time, but this is really thinking through the transitions, the handoffs, preparing, delivering, and how you might manage the Q&A.
And Lynne and I talk about how in a virtual environment, some of the same things that you might do in a regular kind of environment, you just have to amp up a little bit. And so this is what we call modulation, where you change out the slide types intentionally, so that not everything is just, a parade of verbal arguments or charts. Sometimes we do want to have images. Sometimes we want to change the cognitive processes that the audience uses. Sometimes we want to have them intrigued and lean in and start to puzzle over things. Other times we don't want them to puzzle at all. We just want them to be able to evaluate quickly what it is we're saying. So that modulation. And notice we modulate with our voices. We point to things with the way we stress things, the spacing, the timing, the tone of our voices. And also we use our hands a little bit too. Somebody once said that even on a telephone, you use your hands because it helps you articulate and modulate what it is that you're saying. We did get one last question. We're at time here, but I did want to get Lynne's point of view on this too. I answered Donna in text window. She said, do you keep the 1 idea per slide rule for executive level communications as well? My quick answer to that was yes, although sometimes that 1 idea is a single slide that contains the recommendation and 3 or 4 bullet points that are the top level argument for why or how that argument makes sense. And that slide is often the very first one in the deck after you've gathered, greeted, and given them the key question. So sometimes that one idea per slide, the idea can be the whole thing, and that's what we mean by the answer. And we usually recommend having that recommendation slide or that answer slide. That's what comes first, right after we funnel and get them the question. What do you think, Lynn? Is there anything else to say about the one idea per slide?
No, I agree with what you say. And I'm just noticing you also replied back in text to Donna. No, I completely agree. So how we think about one idea is that if you can write that lead that integrates the content, and on the setup slide, that lead would be your actual answer. And then you would have your arguments under there. We would count that as one idea.
Yeah.
Where I think teams get into trouble is they start putting a bunch of different things there, and there's no rhyme or reason to why all that content is there, other than they're just trying to cram it on a slide so they can say, we have a 5-slide presentation.
Yeah.
Because it's an executive audience.
If each slide's got 25 points, it takes longer to unpack, and making it harder and actually not quicker to be able to unpack and to actually connect with your audience. So,
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're at time, so we're going to pass it back to our host. Thank you all for your time this morning. That was a very quick run through a lot of material. We hope it stimulated some ideas, and we hope to see some of you guys in August when we have a chance to stretch out and spend a couple of days on these topics with you.
Yeah, we would love it.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynn and Patrick. And thank you to our audience for spending part of your morning with us. We really appreciate it. As Lynn and Patrick have mentioned, they will be kicking off a short course with the executive education team, Approach Problems Like a Consultant, starting August 19th. For more information and registration, you can find that link inside the chat box. We are, of course, going to be continuing the Business Over Breakfast webinar series in June. We'll be returning with Tom Smith and the Economy and Me on June 4th. And Patrick Noonan will also be returning on June 11th with decoding the analytics of COVID. So again, that information and registration link is also available in the chat box. We do ask that you all take a few moments to fill out this short survey that's going to be popping up on your screen. We'd just like to get some feedback from you all on today's session. A copy of this recording for today's session will be available on the Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page. And we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday, June 4th at 9 a.m. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you again, Lynn and Patrick.
Thank you.